Welcome to Reform Thinking. You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, right?
Yeah, you want things clear-cut, like binary.
Right. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor points to the screen and says, well, there is the fracture.
It's super clean. Broken or not broken.
We like things to be visible, to be categorized neatly into boxes, especially when it comes to fixing a problem.
Oh, totally. It makes us feel in control.
But then you step into the world of human nature and spiritual resilience and the internal life of the mind, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Yeah, it gives you nothing.
You cannot just take a snapshot of the human soul to see what is going on in there. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
It is. I mean, trying to figure out what is genuine inside someone's heart is incredibly difficult.
So today, for our deep dive, we are looking at a 300-year-old manuscript that claims to hold, basically, the definitive x-ray of the human soul.
That is a bold claim.
It really is. We are examining a specific text from Jonathan Edwards. It is from a series of lectures he gave called Charity and Its Fruits.
And his main argument here is wild.
It is arresting, honestly. The thesis he drops right at the beginning is that true Christian grace cannot be overthrown by opposition.
Like, none of it?
Right. No matter how bad the circumstances get, it survives.
To set the stage for anyone listening, we should probably clarify what Edwards means when he uses the word charity.
Yeah, that is a good idea, because the modern definition is way off.
Right, because in our colloquial vocabulary today, charity usually means giving money to a cause, or maybe donating your old winter coats to a thrift store.
Which is great, but that falls entirely short of what we're talking about today.
Way short. Edwards is unpacking the Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 13.7. He is discussing charity as true, supernatural grace and authentic Christian love.
So it's a divine principle implanted in the soul, right?
Yeah.
Not just a philanthropic action you do on a Saturday.
Spot on. Edwards was writing during the 18th century, which was a time of massive religious awakening. But, it was also a time of massive religious confusion.
Because people were having these intense emotional experiences.
Yeah, exactly. And Edwards, acting as a pastor and a theologian, was trying to help people figure out if what they experienced was real.
Like, was it a passing phase, or was it a permanent alteration of their nature?
Right, and this text is his metric for figuring that out.
And his metric is survival. He states that no matter the opposition, this specific grace will survive. It will not be overthrown.
So if we look at 1 Corinthians 13.7, people often read the verse and assume the phrases suffers long, bears all things, and, well, the third one in the King James is endureth all things. People think they are just synonyms.
Right. They read them as three different ways of saying, be patient.
But Edwards says that is a total misunderstanding of the text.
Let's unpack the linguistic distinction he makes here, because it sets up everything else we're going to talk about today.
Well, he corrects the synonym assumption based on a really close reading of the original language. Each phrase points to a different fruit of that grace.
Like a different way it operates under stress.
Yeah. First, he explains that suffers long means bearing injuries received from other people.
So does interpersonal patience.
Right. When someone slanders you, wrongs you, or acts maliciously toward you, this grace prevents you from retaliating in kind.
Okay, so that handles the interpersonal stuff. Then what about bears all things?
That means undergoing suffering for Christ's sake without forsaking your duty. It is about holding your ground when the world pushes against your beliefs.
Or when your circumstances just become incredibly difficult.
Yeah. You don't abandon your post just because the weather turned bad.
So the first is about people, the second is about circumstances, and then we get to the third phrase, the one Edwards builds his entire argument around.
The one usually translated as enduring all things.
Right, but the literal translation of that third phrase is fascinating. It is not just about lasting through time.
No, Edwards points out that the original language signifies that charity remains under all things.
Remains under.
It signifies an abiding nature that stays constant against intense, active opposition. It bears up and bears onward with constancy.
It is not passive resignation.
Not at all. It is an active, weight-bearing load.
Remains under makes me think of structural engineering.
Oh, how so?
Imagine you're in a testing facility, right? And you want to test a new steel alloy's tensile strength.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You do not just tap it with a hammer or leave it out in the rain to see if it rusts.
No, you really push it.
You place it under a hydraulic press.
Yeah.
And you apply immense crushing weight upon this beam You are not seeing if it bends a little bit.
You want to see if it snaps.
Right. You want to see if it maintains its structural integrity under a continuous agonizing load that is actively trying to snap it in half.
That is a great visual.
Grace, in Edwards' view, is the beam that never snaps.
Mm.
The pressure is real, the weight is agonizing, but the beam remains under it.
And Edwards connects this abiding nature to the broader context of the chapter to show how the beam supports the weight.
Because it's not just clenching its teeth, right?
Right. This grace does not remain under the crushing weight by just trying really hard. It promotes two other specific virtues: faith and hope.
Oh, right. Because faith and hope are mainly occupied with suffering.
Exactly. Sufferings are the trials of faith, and what upholds the Christian under that hydraulic press you mentioned is hope.
Specifically, the hope of a future weight of glory that will be given in the end.
Charity cherishes this faith and hope, and as a result, it remains under all things. It cannot be conquered because faith overcomes the world.
And hope enables the Christian to triumph over the immediate pain by, fixing their eyes on the permanent reality of what is to come.
Yeah. It looks past the press.
So if this grace is a beam that won't snap, what is the hydraulic press? What is actually pushing down on the beam?
Well, Edwards does not paint a picture of a peaceful, quiet life, that is for sure.
No, he lists a threefold array of enemies that actively oppose the grace in a Christian's heart. He calls it a hostile environment.
He is incredibly realistic about the human experience. First, he points to external enemies.
The devil and his forces.
Yeah, he describes thousands of artful, mighty, intelligent devils who are bitter enemies to this grace.
For you listening, you might translate the effect of that external pressure as the overwhelming noise in your life, the targeted attacks on your peace.
Or those sudden, inexplicable waves of despair or temptation that just seem to hit you out of nowhere.
Right. Then second, he lists environmental enemies, the world itself.
With all its allurements and its various forms of temptation designed to win you over.
The culture around you that normalizes selfishness and frankly mocks virtue.
And third, which is the most difficult one, he points to internal enemies.
The corruption's inside.
Yeah, the evil thoughts and sinful inclinations that live right within your own breast.
The militant language he uses to describe this whole situation is striking. I mean, he describes the Christian as a pilgrim and a stranger passing through an enemy's country.
Exposed to attack at any moment.
The attacks are not casual or random. They are described as taking a city by storm or coming in like a flood.
These enemies are unwearied, they are implacable, and they seek nothing short of utter ruin.
He says grace under attack is like a spark of fire in swelling billows and raging waves that look like they will swallow it up.
Or he compares it to a flake of snow falling into a burning volcano.
I love that one.
He also uses the image of a pure jewel of gold in the midst of a fiery furnace.
The raging heat is enough to consume anything except pure gold.
Edwards is really trying to shake his audience out of a casual, Sunday morning only view of spirituality.
Yeah, he is saying that if you have genuine grace, you are in a war zone.
Yeah.
The environment you inhabit is actively hostile to the life of God in your soul.
It's not a playground.
I have to pause on that snowflake in a volcano image, though. It is such a vivid picture of vulnerability.
It really is.
And it raises a massive question for anyone listening. If you are under siege and you have an enemy inside the wall,
Have your own internal corruption.
right, which Edwards calls the worst enemies of all, how does the city not fall?
It seems impossible.
I mean, a siege is hard enough when the gates are locked and everyone inside is fighting together. But if you have traitors inside the gates pulling the levers and trying to open the doors for the enemy, failure seems inevitable.
How does the snowflake not melt instantly?
Exactly.
Edwards addresses this logical assumption by drawing on historical parallels. He looks at the Church of God throughout history as a macrocosm of the individual soul.
Okay, give me an example.
Think of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. They united all their craft and strength to wipe out the Israelites.
They had everything on their side.
They had the military might, the political authority, and the geographical advantage. By all earthly logic, the Israelites should have been completely exterminated.
But they survived.
Right. The bush was burning, but it was not consumed.
He also mentions David in the wilderness, right?
Yeah, David was anointed to be king, but for years he was hunted like a partridge on the mountains.
Driven from cave to cave by Saul, and Saul was a sitting king with an entire standing army at his disposal.
David had no resources, no army of his own at first, just a promise from God.
Yet David survived and took the throne.
He expands this to the early Christian church surviving severe, bloody persecutions from the heathen world.
where millions were killed without respect to age or sex.
The Roman Empire used all of its legislative and military might to stamp out Christianity. By all appearances, the church should have been destroyed.
But the seed remained. The fire stayed alive in the floods.
Edwards uses these historical realities to prove a theological point. God has a track record of preserving his people in completely impossible scenarios.
What he does on a macro scale in history, he does on a micro scale in the individual human heart.
Precisely.
That historical track record is fascinating, but it moves us to a very practical question. The attacks are severe, the enemies are relentless, and we see people in our own lives, or maybe we have experienced it ourselves, where the pressure comes and the person just seems to collapse.
We see people walk away.
Right. So why do some people seem to fall away while others survive? Why does the snow melt for some, while for others it somehow withstands the volcano?
Edwards makes a crucial distinction here between authentic grace and false, or counterfeit grace.
Because they look very similar at first.
They do. And this is where Edwards' skill as a diagnostician really shines. The reason some seem to fall away is that they never possessed the true article to begin with.
They had something that looked like grace.
Sounded like grace, and maybe even felt like grace for a little while, but it was a counterfeit.
He contrasts true and false grace based on how they interact with sin in the human heart, right?
Yeah. False grace is a superficial show. It might stir up some temporary emotions.
You might feel a rush of gratitude or a sudden fear of consequences.
Or a strong desire to clean up your life. But it leaves the core corruption unmortified.
Meaning it doesn't kill it.
Right. If it wounds sin at all, the wounds are slight. They do not reach the life of the sin. It leaves the sin in its full strength within the soul.
So when the pressure of the hydraulic press comes down, it is no wonder the sin prevails and bears down all before it.
It just takes over again.
This makes me think of an analogy in medicine. Imagine a person treating a severe, life-threatening illness. Counterfeit grace is like taking a heavy painkiller for a tumor.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
The painkiller makes you feel better temporarily. The immediate discomfort is gone, so you walk around thinking you are cured. You have a false sense of peace.
But the surgeon never actually went in.
Right. The disease retains its full dominion in your body, quietly growing stronger while you feel fine.
True grace, according to Edwards, is the surgeon. It strikes at the vitals.
It gives the disease a mortal wound.
It sends its stroke to the very heart of the corruption. It does not just mask the symptoms, it attacks the root cause.
And surgery is invasive. True grace enters the soul and begins a never-ceasing conflict.
It dispossesses sin of its dominion. It removes sin from the throne of the heart.
While counterfeit grace never dethrones the sin, so the sin just waits for the painkiller to wear off.
And when the emotional high fades, the person goes right back to their old ways because their fundamental nature was never altered.
So how does a person know if they have the painkiller or the surgeon?
Edwards highlights some very specific behavioral differences you can look for. The text points out that counterfeit grace is careless about the future.
It is not founded on any thorough conviction of the reality of spiritual danger.
It is not diligent in prayer. It assumes everything will just work out fine.
But true grace, however, is deeply watchful.
It is heavily reliant on prayer because it is sensible the immense dangers encompassing it.
It hungers and thirsts for preservation. It lays hold on divine strength to support it.
You can really see the difference in how they handle a failure.
What do you mean?
Well, when someone with counterfeit grace fails, they often make excuses, minimize it, or simply give up and say the standard is too high. But when someone with true grace fails, it grieves them. They hate the sin that caused the failure, and they run back to God for cleansing and strength.
The presence of that grief and that fight is the evidence of the new nature.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on this a little bit, or at least ask a question that might be bothering you if you are listening right now.
Okay, let's hear it.
If true grace takes the throne, acts like the surgeon, and gives sin a mortal wound, why does Edwards say the believer still carries around corruptions that are their worst enemies?
That is the big question.
Right. If the disease is mortally wounded, why is there still a war going on inside my head?
This brings up an essential theological reality about the Christian life. Sin is dethroned, and it is mortally wounded, meaning its final death is absolutely guaranteed.
But it is not yet fully dead.
Right. Think of it like an occupying army that has lost its capital city, its commanding general, and its supply lines.
The war is decidedly won. The outcome is no longer in doubt.
But the remaining soldiers are now fighting a desperate, violent guerrilla campaign in the countryside. Ah, I see.
The new nature creates an active, violent war within the soul. Before true grace entered, there was a false, careless peace because sin was fully in charge and unchallenged.
So the presence of the war itself.
The fact that you feel the conflict and hate the internal corruption is evidence that the capital has been taken by the rightful king.
That makes a lot of sense. The conflict isn't a sign that you are failing. The conflict is a sign that the painkiller wore off and the surgeon is actually doing the work.
Yes.
You are feeling the pain of the incision and the healing process. But this shifts our discussion to the actual anger of preservation.
Because we established that true grace fights a winning war, but we have to look at the reason for that assured victory.
Right. Because, if we are honest, even a mortally wounded enemy can be dangerous if the person fighting it gets exhausted.
A guerrilla army can still do a lot of damage if the new government runs out of resources.
Edwards makes a massive pivot here. He highlights that believers are not kept by the inherent strength of the grace itself. This is huge. The grace inside you, your own personal holiness, your own willpower, is not what guarantees your survival.
You are kept by the mighty hand of God. He references 1 Peter 1.5, saying believers are kept by the force of God through faith unto salvation.
This is a vital distinction to make. To prove this, Edwards contrasts the believer with Adam, our first parent.
Okay, let's look at Adam.
Adam was created with a principle of holiness in his heart, and here is the key. Adam had no internal corruption to contend with.
He had no guerrilla fighters hiding in the countryside of his soul. His x-ray was completely clean.
He had a perfect will, a perfect environment, and direct communion with God.
Yet he was overthrown. He fell.
He fell because his standing depended entirely on his own free will, his own inherent strength.
And Edwards argues from the greater to the lesser here.
Right. If Adam fell when he was comparatively perfectly strong and had no internal enemies, what would happen to fallen humans?
We have imperfect grace, manifold powerful enemies, and active internal corruptions.
If our perseverance depended on our own willpower amidst all these active enemies, we would certainly perish.
We would not last a single day against the thousands of artful devils in our own traitorous hearts.
Which raises a massive theological question.
If God set up the first arrangement with Adam, and it failed because it relied on human free will, why is the second arrangement fundamentally different?
Yeah, why didn't God just wind us up again, wipe the slate clean, and say, well, try harder this time?
The text explains this by contrasting the two covenants. If salvation relied on human steadfastness, it would be a covenant of works.
And a true covenant of free mercy means God undertakes the matter entirely.
The first arrangement in the garden was holy and just. It was a fair test.
But it lacked a sure ground of perseverance because it rested on human ability.
The second arrangement, the covenant of grace, was introduced specifically to supply what was missing in the first.
It rests on God completing what he started. It does not depend on the variable, fluctuating willpower of the human being.
It depends on the immutable, unchanging will of God.
And Edwards does not just leave this as a broad philosophical statement. He builds an absolute fortress around this idea.
He really does. The text provides a rapid-fire sequence of 7 theological proofs for why God will never allow this grace to be overthrown.
We need to walk through these 7 pillars of assured victory slowly, because this is the bedrock of his entire argument.
If you understand these pillars, the fear of losing your standing completely evaporates. So let's take them one by one.
Okay, the first pillar Edwards builds is the concept of incomplete redemption.
What does that mean in this context?
He argues that Christ died to redeem us from evil and bring us to glory. If Christ only brought us back to Adam's precarious state.
Meaning we were forgiven, but left just as liable to fall again tomorrow.
Right, then the whole redemption would be flawed. It might be made void. It would be an imperfect rescue.
It makes me think of a firefighter running into a burning building.
Oh, I like this.
The firefighter throws you over their shoulder, carries you past the flames, navigates the falling debris, gets you all the way to the front door.
And then just drops you right back in the living room and leaves.
Exactly. What was the point of the rescue if you are left in a state where you could just catch fire again?
A complete redemption has to actually secure the person all the way to the end.
They have to take you out of the burning building, put you in the ambulance, and get you to the hospital. Christ did not die just to reset the clock. He died to secure the final outcome.
Which leads directly into his second pillar. The second covenant. We touched on this slightly, but Edwards formalizes it here as a legal framework.
The legal side is so crucial to his argument.
The first covenant had a head and surety, which was Adam, who was liable to fail. Therefore, God provided a head for the new covenant who cannot fail.
Right.
Yes, the first covenant could be shaken. The new one is ordered in all things and sure, because the person guaranteeing it is divine.
Let's pause on that word, surety. It is a legal term that Edward's 18th century audience would understand intuitively, but we need to break it down.
Think of it like co-signing a massive loan.
Right. You want to buy a house, but you have terrible credit and no money.
The bank will not give you the loan based on your own standing.
So a billionaire steps in and signs the paperwork as your surety.
The bank grants the loan. If you default, the bank does not look at you. They look at the billionaire who guaranteed the contract.
His immense wealth secures your house. In the first covenant, Adam was the surety for the human race, and he defaulted.
In the second covenant, Christ is the surety. He guarantees the outcome with his own infinite merit.
That leads perfectly into the third pillar, which focuses on the difference between grace and works.
Edwards says eternal life cannot be suspended on human strength.
If it is a covenant of grace, then free grace undertakes the whole matter to finish it.
It has not left the outcome to the strength of our own wills. If divine grace starts the work, it will finish it.
If any part of the final preservation relied on your own performance, then it ceases to be grace and becomes a wage you earned.
So if my standing isn't based on my performance today, how does that legally work?
Edwards addresses this with his fourth pillar, the victorious second surety. He takes that cosigner analogy and expands it to representation.
When Adam, our first surety, failed, everyone he represented fell with him.
He was condemned as the legal head of the human race, and his posterity was condemned.
If he had stood the test, he would have been justified, and his posterity would have been confirmed in life.
But Christ is the second Adam. He has already persevered.
He has already faced the devil, the world, and the full weight of the law, and he did what the first surety failed to do.
He stood, he was justified by his perfect obedience, and he is confirmed in eternal life through his resurrection.
Therefore, by parity of reason, everyone who is represented by him is also accepted and confirmed.
His fulfillment of the terms makes the perseverance of his people an absolute certainty.
You are not fighting for victory. You are fighting from a victory that has already been legally secured by your representative.
That flows right into the fifth pillar,
Yeah.
actual justification.
The believer is already fully acquitted in the courtroom of God.
Justification is a full deliverance from guilt and hell and a full title to eternal life.
Edwards argues that it is completely inconsistent to say someone is fully acquitted and delivered from hell today, but their attainment of eternal life tomorrow is still suspended on their uncertain future performance.
It would be a contradiction in terms. You cannot be fully pardoned, handed a royal decree of total forgiveness, while still being on trial for the same crimes, with the threat of execution hanging over your head.
If justification is a past, completed event, then future glorification is an unavoidable reality.
The judges bang the gavel.
But even if my legal standing is secure, I still feel weak. I feel like my own life force, my own spiritual energy is draining away under the pressure.
Edwards anticipates this, and his sixth pillar shifts from legal arguments to biological ones. It is the pillar of resurrection life.
The text teaches that the believer's spiritual life is actually a partaking of Christ's immortal life.
He references passages about the believer being quickened together with Christ and Christ living in the believer.
The life animating the true Christian is not their own natural energy. It is the resurrected life of Jesus operating within them.
I want to look at the branch and tree concept Edwards uses here.
Oh, this is brilliant if you understand grafting in agriculture.
If you have a frail, dying branch and you graft it into a massive, healthy tree that cannot die.
A tree with an indestructible root system.
Right. That branch now shares the life sap of the host tree. Its survival is no longer dependent on its own severed, limited resources.
It is a biological guarantee. Because death has no more dominion over the tree, it has no more dominion over the grafted branch.
As long as the root lives, the branch lives.
And finally, we arrive at the seventh pillar, God's triumphant implantation.
Grace is something God implanted in the heart against massive opposition.
The internal enemies and external devils use their utmost endeavors to keep it out.
But God used his all-conquering might to introduce it triumphantly.
Edwards argues logically that God will not, at the last moment, surrender himself to be conquered by allowing those same enemies to expel what he so triumphantly brought in.
He breached the walls, took the city, planted his flag, and he is not going to just hand the keys back to the enemy because the guerrilla fighters are making a lot of noise.
When you look at these 7 points in complete redemption, the second covenant, grace versus works, the victorious second surety, actual justification, resurrection life, and triumphant implantation, you see Edwards constructing an airtight, logically sequenced theological fortress.
He removes every possible angle where doubt could creep in regarding God's ability to preserve the believer.
Understanding this airtight guarantee actually explains a lot about the spiritual warfare believers experience.
Specifically, it explains why the adversary fights so desperately before a person crosses the line into faith.
This brings us to Edwards' application regarding Satan's desperation. Edwards says that understanding this preservation doctrine explains why the devil so exceedingly opposes the conversion of sinners in the first place.
The devil knows the theology we just discussed.
He knows that if a soul is once converted, they are forever converted.
They are forever put beyond his reach, and he can never overthrow them. He has lost them permanently.
So his only strategy is to stop the surgery from happening at all.
The text details the specific tactics he uses to prevent this.
Yeah.
Before a person crosses that line into true grace, Satan heaps mountains in their way to hinder the work.
He tries to quench convictions of sin. If someone starts feeling guilty and looking for answers, he tries to lead them back to sloth or distract them with worldly entertainment.
He flatters them with their own goodness, or he discourages them with their own badness.
The psychological warfare Edwards describes is incredibly astute.
Satan suggests blasphemous thoughts to perplex their minds. He tempts them by pointing out their own helplessness, whispering, you can't change, why even try?
He tells them their day of mercy is past, or terrifies them with the idea that they have committed the unpardonable sin and God has already shut the door.
Or, on the flip side, he tells them there is plenty of time left, they are young, they should enjoy their life now, and get serious about religion when they are older.
If you are listening to this and you have experienced intense doubt, terrifying thoughts, or severe spiritual attacks when you try to move closer to God, this provides a completely different lens for those struggles.
You might think those attacks are evidence that you are failing, or that God has abandoned you.
But based on Edwards' text, that intense warfare might actually be evidence of Satan's panic.
He is throwing everything at the wall because he knows that once the surgeon successfully operates, his dominion is permanently over.
The noise you hear is the sound of a desperate, losing enemy trying to prevent a transaction he knows he cannot reverse.
That reframing changes everything. But Edwards balances this encouragement with a sobering reality check. We have to address the seeming grace.
He talks about those who appear to have this grace, but who eventually fall away.
He compares them to the morning cloud and the early dew, which passes away as soon as the sun gets hot.
Let's say someone has experienced a season of religious excitement. They felt terrified of their sin. They felt comforted by hearing about God's mercy.
They joined a church. They reformed their habits.
But then, over time, the novelty wore off. They returned to their old habits. They stopped praying in private.
They went back to gratifying their carnal appetites when no one was looking.
How does Edwards view their situation? He leaves no room for ambiguity.
He says that if a person returns to those carnal appetites and neglects known duties when the initial excitement fades, then the initial appearance was deceptive.
It was never true grace.
He uses the analogy of blossoms on a tree in spring. Many of them look beautiful. They look exactly like the blossoms that will produce fruit.
But a strong wind comes or a frost hits and they fall off before ever bearing anything. The promise of the blossom failed.
The result proves the appearance was only an appearance. Those who trust in a temporary emotional high without an abiding change in their heart and life are awfully deluded.
True grace creates an abiding change. The new creature continues. If there is no continuation, there was no new creature.
That is a heavy warning. It forces you to evaluate the foundation of your own actions.
Are you relying on a painkiller you took 10 years ago at a youth camp? Or have you undergone the surgery that produced a lasting, fighting change in your nature?
But we move from that sobering warning to the supreme comfort offered to those who possess the genuine article. This is Edwards' final application for the believers.
And it is a majestic application. He calls true grace an inestimable jewel.
He says it is worth more than all the jewels, precious stones, crowns, and costly treasures in the universe.
Because those physical treasures can be lost, stolen, or left behind at death.
But the comfort of this spiritual jewel is that the person who possesses it will never lose it, because the one who gave it will keep it for them through all eternity.
He says believers stand on the munitions of rocks with the everlasting arms underneath them.
Whatever bitterness their enemies manifest, they can laugh their foes to scorn because Jehovah is their defense.
Look at the psychological benefit of this theology on the battlefield. Edwards finishes by talking about the morale of a soldier.
He points out that fighting a war with the expectation of defeat debilitates you. Despondency weakens a soldier.
If you think you're going to lose, you don't fight very hard.
But fighting with the absolute assurance of victory increases strength. It cooperates with your efforts and fuels your endurance.
Think of a sports team heading into the fourth quarter down by 40 points. Their shoulders slump, they run slower, they give up on the hard plays.
Now imagine a scenario where a general is fighting a skirmish and he has already intercepted the enemy's unconditional surrender letter.
The war is officially over, the treaty is signed, but there is one last pocket of resistance to clear out before they go home.
Those soldiers do not fight lazily. They fight with unparalleled boldness and joy. They know the final outcome is already written in stone.
That is precisely the morale Edwards wants to impart to the Christian. He brings the source material to a climax by focusing on the captain of salvation.
This captain guarantees the outcome. He has promised that you shall overcome, and his promise shall never fail.
The soldier is told to rest on that promise, be faithful to their part in the skirmish, and know that the captain will personally place the crown of victory upon their head.
Let's recap the progression of this deep dive. We started by defining what it means to remain under opposition, that lasting, abiding nature of genuine charity under the hydraulic press.
We walked through the fierce, threefold battles it faces from the devil, the world, and internal corruptions.
We distinguish the temporary painkiller of false grace from the surgical strike of true grace, noting that the ongoing war in your soul is evidence of life, not death.
And then we laid out the 7-pillar theological bedrock that guarantees God will preserve his people.
Noting how this absolute legal and biological security changes the way we understand Satan's desperate attacks and our own daily warfare.
If we look at how this applies to you, the listener, this knowledge is not meant to be abstract theology stored on a dusty shelf.
Edwards did not preach this to fill people's heads with trivia. It is meant to be highly practical armor for your daily life.
It is the framework that holds you up when the crushing weight comes down.
You are fighting from a secured victory, not for an uncertain one. The legal paperwork is signed. The tree of life is supplying the sap.
This raises a final thought to leave with you. We talked about how your internal corruptions are your worst enemies, but they are mortally wounded.
If your absolute worst spiritual enemy is completely aware that they cannot actually destroy you, how much of the fear you feel today is based on an illusion?
What would your life look like tomorrow if you treated your internal corruptions, your anxieties, and your temptations not as fatal threats, but as defeated foes awaiting their final eviction?
The X-ray might be murky to us, but the outcome is crystal clear to the surgeon. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Reformed thinking. We will catch you next time.